my goal for today is to largely start talking about this additional mechanism that we've kind of noted but haven't really delved deep into, called imposeProfile, with the goal of just kind of getting us comfortable and thinking through it and starting the discussion of, would we want to use something like this? How would we want to use something like this? Specifically in relation to trying to kind of think through what our guidelines for use look like as we have more and more mechanisms available to describe our relationships to other profiles and guides. So just a bit of housekeeping before we kick it off. So we have had some back-to-back governance calls, but I think we were off last week while folks were traveling back from the FHIR or the HL7 working group meeting. We are back to a regular schedule, so we're going to have a bit more of a like a technical dive in today. The other piece is we were on the HL7 Canada Council call earlier this week, and we were talking about the recent discussions and like the feedback we've been getting around URI and OID registry questions, and not really having a great place to kind of house those. So what I'll say is, I know we were starting to talk about this in our last governance call, a little bit more deep dive into it. I'll ask if we can save and kind of put some of those questions to good use at the next HL7 Canada community call. That's August 3rd. I'll put the details here for the call-in meeting.
October 3rd?
Sorry?
October 3rd?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, you're right. It's October 3rd.
I know you're trying to make time summer, but come on.
We need our OIDs now. I think this is the right call-in. Yep, October 3rd. So we asked if we get on the agenda specifically to start housing some of that questions, and we will see if we can get some more resident experts there to provide a little bit of background and guidance on how we start resolving some of these issues. So the goal being that, if you do have discrete questions you want to ask, it can be helpful if you can forward those along to Joni or to Ron. We can make sure they get plugged into the agenda, or just show up on that day and ask them, and hopefully we can get to them all. As for today, so I think I mentioned previously, we've been talking a lot about new mechanisms that are available to us in FHIR. Some big things happened in the kind of FHIR infrastructure over the last 6 months plus around the ability to kind of backport and bring in mechanisms through extensions that were previously defined and were part of the R5 and R6 releases, or just R5 release, but that are now available to us to potentially use as a cross-version extension for R4 guides, which our Canadian FHIR baseline is currently released in. So we talked about obligations, which falls into that bucket, and we to date have really said, here's what the extension does, here's the value of it, here's the purpose and where it's specifically helpful to be applied. And then we started kind of trying to talk through how might we use obligations under our current interpretation of must support in the places where it is, knowing that it is surfaced as an alternative to some of the challenges that are present in must support. But we haven't really gotten to imposeProfile. And so if folks are interested in those other mechanisms, we can certainly point you to our kind of YouTube channel where we've started the conversation around them. But I kind of want to get into the meat of it and just to frame it a little bit more. So the last 6 months or so, the National Basin Core authors and National iGuide authors have been trying to work together to identify, a number of these new FHIR mechanisms and how they potentially solve problems for our kind of various landscapes and the way that we apply profiles together for any given use case. And the goal is to identify the best sets of mechanisms that allow for downstream profiles to have relationships to more than one parent. And I'm going to keep it broad here and call it like relationships to more than one parent. And if you're operating in a country that, you basically have, a pretty streamlined standards development organization that just produces primarily the guides, the FHIR implementation guides in your country, traditional linear reprofiling often makes sense because you have control over things like actually what goes into the parent and to the child. You have control over release schedules, how changes are synchronized over time. And where linear reprofiling starts to be less straightforward is typically when you start to see, profiles that are intended to work together, but they're hosted by different organizations or different initiatives, or they run on different release cycles with different teams. The other place we often see in this kind of challenge arising is when you also have a layer with a regional or jurisdictional set of profiles or guides that are also kind of involved. So, and a lot of times we talk about layers, we're talking about, an international or universal realm use case, a national base or core, potentially a jurisdictional base or core, and a jurisdictional implementation guide. So we've already experienced, I think, some of these kind of, how do we synchronize and how do we keep up to date? And how do we show that we are actually aligned to everyone we need to be aligned with? That's something that I think many of us on the call have experienced over the last year or two. So ding, 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 that's something that the baseline also considers relevant, as well as this last piece, which is when you have to try to figure out in this real life scenario, when you're trying to show, okay, I've got this international use case and I want to combine it with my national requirements in my base or my core. Oftentimes that is kind of not a total linear relationship, or exclusively linear relationship is the best way to say it. So we have we've experienced a lot of these situations in one way or another in our profiles, and we are particularly experiencing, I would say, at least the first and the last bullet with our CA baseline, right? We have this additional layer of complexity because we have a base that is hosted as a grassroots, meaning it's not hosted by a single organization that also controls both a core or a subsequent use case implementation guide. And we are operating on a release schedule that is aligned with how grassroots, implementation guides are managed, which means oftentimes our users can get ahead of where we are. And so I wanted to bring some of what we've been talking about in the kind of national core and base space to you folks today, and start exploring whether or not we want to maybe take some stances around some of the mechanisms that are available to us. So the 4 categories that we had kind of identified early on was, and this should look actually pretty familiar with our categories, or at least the way we talked about in our technical kind of walkthrough for iGuide authors, the ways in which you can describe a relationship back to the CA FHIR baseline. So we actually took a lot of those findings and tried to insert it into the national iGuide conversations. So you've got this kind of like compilation or informal alignment, right? So either you're basically hosting your content separately and then making statements about how they fit together or how they're informally aligned. Largely, that's something we experience. It's available to us today. No new mechanism there. Then there's reprofiling. And we've talked about reprofiling in the past as kind of like, there are times when it's really, really powerful, and also times when, it can be challenging, right? So a lot of the time, a lot of the criteria that we talked about just in the last slide around being managed by a different organization or no organization, having a different release cycle, having kind of a delay between when issues are identified by the downstream user and the upstream guide, challenges around, essentially maintenance over time. These are all kind of conditions that you want to evaluate when you're considering reprofiling, as well as the degree of times that you're going to reprofile on top of it. So we had that all in kind of our technical walkthrough that we made, 60 months ago. The 2 pieces that are new are assertions and obligations. So talked about obligations. I want to talk about assertions. So assertions kind of at base level sounds like, okay, are we asserting kind of informal alignment? And that is one of the potential mechanisms that's available to us in this category. But essentially, there's 2 new extensions that are housed and available to us iGuide authors literally today to trial and experiment and utilize to claim a relationship between our target, like our profiles, and, or sorry, I should say our host profiles and a desired target profile. So there's really two flavors of this. The complies with extension basically is, it's a full assertion. It's a business statement that says, instances that are valid against my profile, the host profile, I'm making the statement that they're automatically valid against the target profile. So I'm kind of like telling you that I have done the due diligence with the profile that I am pointing to as a target, and I know anything that is produced under my rules will be valid. The other flavor of that, which I think is slightly, I don't know if it's more strict, but it's at least more mechanical, is the imposeProfile extension. And that is, instances can only be valid against my profile if they are validated against the target profile. And there's a component to this that is in its deployment in our current infrastructure that's really important, in that, from what I know today, imposeProfile, when it's indicated, if you are using something like the FHIR validator or IG publisher, will actually execute the validation against your target profile. So if I'm saying, okay, validate this instance against, my example profile A, and I'm imposing target profile B, the validator is going to check both, and it will not be considered valid to my profile A if any of the rules in B are considered not, like, if they're violated, like hard violated errors. So I'm going to pause here because I can dive a little bit more into this, but are there folks who are interested in pulling up both complies with and impose, or do we like the assessment in the kind of National iGuide authors group was like, this is much stronger and like something that maybe more usable because it has that extra validation step. Are folks interested in looking at both? Is there any value that we would have for making us, like, for utilizing an extension that is only kind of a soft assertion, but that isn't checkable? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Should I take silence as maybe start with impose, and then we can talk through the benefits and the risks of potentially utilizing something that has harder constraints?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to put this in the chat so you guys can follow along. Now, what I will say is, because these are still kind of experimental, they're still very early in their kind of progression into the FHIR extensions guide. The definitions online aren't that great for both implies and complies with. For both impose and complies with. So what I've done is basically kind of taken the definition and then kind of try to provide a little bit more context to it. But I want you to have this in your back pocket. So if you do have questions about, like, how is it structured? What's the maturity level? Because this is important. It still is kind of an experimental draft extension. Let me just see real quick if I can get the as well. This is the complies with. Okay, so realistically, what we have to go off of is the definitions and some light testing that we've done on complies with versus impose. Effectively, both are structured similar ways, right? So you've got, this is the, the extension definition. The idea is when you apply it, you say, this is the extension that I'm applying, and my value is going to point to my target profile that I'm trying to comply to. The same structure is met with on the impose profile. It's, the use of the extension and this extension URL conveys a meaning, and the value is, this is the target that this meaning should be applied to. and that this is the target that helps the validation and, for example, know to execute a secondary step. So the biggest values to something like impose or complies is that it allows for authors like ourselves to be able to kind of make these claims, even if they're reprofiling from something else. So multi-inheritance has always been a really big challenge in FHIR, and there are still components of rendering and validation that are complex and still being worked out with this kind of secondary inheritance. But, you know, what we can at least determine from its current implementation within the FHIR IG publisher is that at minimum, the use of imposeProfile is at least like executing the secondary validation step, where it's looking at things like hard terminology bindings. It's looking at cardinality constraints that are restrictive. It's looking at the things that should be errors in this other guide that you can definitively tell in an instance. It's not looking at things like must support, because the goal of this extension is to apply to instances, not necessarily to convey something that would be validatable from a profiles perspective. And why that's really important is that a lot of our profiles have this concept of must support. And so that is the kind of one of the existing gaps today that, you know, we can't entirely solve with imposeProfile. But for instance, if one of our downstream guides had a rule around identifiers having to be used, but maybe it didn't slice for identifiers like we do in the baseline, that applying an imposeProfile somewhere in this inheritance chain would allow for instances that are compliant with my profile to also be checked if they supply, for instance, that this is an identifier with a type of MRN, which we do have subsequent conditional rules around in the baseline. So those kind of hard constraints around cardinality or patterning or expectations, which there are a handful of in a guide like the baseline and in some of our guides themselves, can be checked. But I think even more maybe critically is that like it's also providing that social linkage, which is to say, I've looked and I know that there are no conflicts as an iGuide author that's applying this extension, and I am explicitly trying to make this relationship present, which is really powerful in itself. Are there any questions so far about how this actually gets used? Because I've got a diagram that I can kind of show, and actually, maybe even better, I've got you can see it in action in the current AU IPS. This is an example one. This is the one that Graham had put out and presented last week around how impose could be used alongside reprofiling for this exact problem. So I'll just expand this a little bit and show you guys what I'm seeing. So we've got this extension that allows you to host this assertion that points to another guide or points to another profile that instances also have to be valid against. How this works out in the AU example, so Australia example. So they've got their Australian allergy intolerance, patient summary. It derives, because it's a use case profile, from the equivalent use case guide, which in this case is a universal realm international patient summary. So that's where we're seeing this is reprofiling, right? Now they're doing some things additional in the screen, like also adding in their references to their specific, patients and additional explicit rules that they have for their use case that go beyond IPS and that go beyond their core. They also now have kind of introduced this idea of reprofiling from a parent imposing a secondary parent's expectations. So this is pointing to their specific AU core allergy intolerance, which has you know, another set of rules, and actually maybe we can even open that up together to take a look at it. So very light. And they, and that's, I think, largely driven by, they don't have any additional requirements that they've defined beyond the IPS so far, which is why that looks that way. This is their AU core allergy intolerance. So they have some cardinality restrictions. They have some restrictions on essentially reference targets. So if you're going to supply me an allergy intolerance, it has to have a valid AU core patient. But a lot of this stuff is must support. So this imposeProfile that they have would really be kind of validating for only a handful of the kind of hard rules that they currently have. But it provides, I think, the social linkage to say, we have these additional expectations, even if the instances aren't being validated against the must supports, because those are expectations that are supposed to apply to systems. What do people think of this? Is this confusing, or is this kind of like what you had imagined multiple inheritance would eventually kind of look like?
I don't find it confusing. And it's basically just saying, you know, check that it conforms to this and that, right?
Yeah, that instances have to be valid against these rules, which is the sum of this plus this plus this, but it's the hard rules that they have on like the records, not necessarily the system's behavior.
I'm not sure this is the constraint applied to the profile. I think this probably may also apply to the element individually or not.
Let's see. Let's open it up. So Thomas, that's a really good question. So we can see whether or not an extension can be applied on profiles or at the individual element level through the context of use. So when I open up the current definition, the context of use is just the structure definition. That's slightly different from obligations that we've been looking at recently, where you can see the context of use is structure definition, element definition. So you could apply it on the elements or element definition type. Were you thinking there might be value to doing it at the element level rather than at the whole profile level?
I'm not 100% sure about that right now. What I thought may go to both, because actually, when you talk about the instance, that's quite different as a than with the profile. Instance is instance, but actually, the value put into the instance also trigger another concern about the cost. How to verify or validate instance can only go through the UAT or maybe the validation process, and cannot go to the operation stage in that manner. Yeah, there's a value there, but actually just the instance level, you know, the value there, instead of from this with the provision of this mechanism, may we go through the, you know, something else. You know, this is eventually we still need to go to machine learning that part. We'll go to the reasoning that part, but so far I'm not sure this is kind of temporary solution or just like how to say use case based or, you know, project or business oriented solution.
The way I've been kind of thinking about it is it's primarily like that our challenge that we have around having to combine multiple business requirements and expectations across our various profiles, that this is like one piece of the solution, and that this piece is geared more towards both profile authors as a primary audience, but also for assistance at the time when you're doing essentially testing against your primary profile. So for example, where this could help would be if I'm developing example instances, as many of us do when we're starting to develop an implementation guide and a set of profiles, because I want to know, okay, do my rules actually match up to my rules as I expect them, match up to what the record has to look like or the instance has to look like in order to be valid. And as iGuide authors at that stage, even before we expose it to our vendor communities, we're able to kind of catch right off the bat. If I provided an instance that met my rules and I said, also these other rules apply and they didn't, then I know that ultimately I have to kind of identify and address that conflict. But this is also helpful when we go through things like actual doing testing and we're working with our vendors to go through, okay, have you provided your own example instance based on your configuration and tested against these profiles? It can be also used at that, but that typically isn't a production level. That's usually what happens at testing events. So there's no silver bullet that I have come across so far. But I mean, are people looking at this as having other primary audiences and purposes that it could be utilized more effectively?
Well, if let's go to the testing perspective, I would say might better to think about it, go to the element level, because actually that is really the value comes out. Because you put the profile level, you still need to have to figure out where to go for each element, and you have to go to the two profile or multiple profile to give a test. Just from class perspective, right? You have the parent class and go to two children or three children. Let's say two children is example, a very simple one. And if each one have this own, new data attribute there, and it's try to go track to both to the, or right now, sorry, let's go to the wrong direction. Sorry, you have a two parent right now, one child, and they have to figure out which one attribute comes from the parent one, and one go to parent B, two, and that's actually just go to the attribute level, which is here is the data element level, and not a profile, which is a class equivalent.
And some of that might come down to like you're implementing validation framework. So the way I was talking to Graham about this a couple of days ago, and the way that he has it set up, if you're using, for instance, FHIR validator, or you're using the validation that occurs in the IG publisher, is that when he sees a profile defined on this extension, what he basically does is when you load your example and you say, okay, this is the profile I'm saying this instance conforms to. He runs the snapshot, he checks the FHIR, he basically like checks FHIR packages and actually gets, this is the package for profile A. Runs against the instance against the snapshot expectations, and then also does that as a secondary step against profile B. So it's the way it's currently set up today. And again, this is trial. So we can think about how this applies to our business requirements and make recommendations. But it kind of is basically saying all of the rules, and there's simplicity in that, at least in the way that the validation framework is working, on the Java side of things, because it's really just saying, find me the snapshot, run the validation against it. Now, that may not be true for all validation tools and frameworks that are in place, but like if we thought there would be a business requirement, and I'm giving it as an example. I actually think that this one we may have to talk about. But if you had a reason for saying, I may not comply to all of the hard constraints in this profile, my instances may not be expected to hit all of them, but I only care about a few, that's when you might want to look at having this be on the element level instead of just the structure definition. But that's a philosophical question, which is, do we want people to get to pick and choose? Or would we like their problems to be resolved with us rather than just choosing the things that we expect that fit with their world model? Is there interest in exploring that element by element? I mean, from the baseline perspective?
My opinion, if you start going down to that element by element level, it gets really messy really fast.
Yeah, I don't quite understand going down to an element by element level. It only makes sense to me to be doing the profiling at the higher level.
Well, sorry, just try to clarify. When we talk about the profile level, I'm talking about behalf of the human user. When I talk about element level, I'm talking about behalf of the machine user.
Oh,
I don't understand how that
Well,
changes things or.
well, we think about to put the FHIR profile as a beginning configuration setup file to let the machine to run it. It's better get a element level, so they can do the comparison, go to different profile, which is being utilized as a template there. You go to the template A, B, C, D, E, and get a conformance done. They'll go to element level, and maybe more deeper than element level, go to the data type, and everything should be URI or you identify in that manner. That's a long story. Sorry, stop here.
Problem when you start doing that is it becomes really complex because now you have to check every single element to see if it has a reference that you have to confirm, rather than at a higher level than say the package is or isn't.
I'm
Right?
guessing this is a kind of headache from Graham, and when he tried to build the IG Pro publisher, there's lots of headache there. So eventually, actually, everything should go to computable, not
And-
human.
and I think we'll learn more about this. So I've asked Lord from FHIR to start thinking about how this might be rendered and how it might be validated. And we talked a little bit about differences for how it might work from that perspective. But I do think we do know that the system or machine behaviors beyond just like these hard rules are things that aren't fully covered by the imposeProfile extension. So in my mind, we probably won't get to the full future state that you're describing, Thomas, with the combination of reprofiling, impose, and obligations. But things like obligations, which are more geared towards the system behaviors, and like when this happens, does this occur, might close more of that gap than the impose, which is really just caring about like is a record that's generated and valid against this also valid against this.
I do agree. But a good thing that I observed, just thank you for sharing that the link, they do offer a canonical or maybe official called more stable URI with that impose extension. That's good news.
Ah, okay. So so you're probably referring to like looking at within the structure definition. I'm going to pull it up in JSON, but like the value canonical that's provided to say this is the profile, secondary profile, and the location in which to validate it, or the location in which you can identify the profile in your system.
Yeah, it is here. You can let the machine knows where it is. Human as well, sorry.
Yeah. So, I think if you were to look at an example of complies, and I haven't mocked that one up, but I think it would look in the JSON very similar. I think the primary difference is, if you get a slightly different rendering and whether or not there's an execution of the secondary validation, given that you're making that assertion. But so basically, I wanted to kind of show you how this is being used within another like combination of use case and core. I want to also point out that like Australia is putting together a core. They also have a base. Now they have basically their AU core is reprofiled from their AU base, but that's managed within the same organization, the same team, the same processes, the same release cycles. And so synchronization is guaranteed. So what I want to start exploring if we think that there might be some value, like if applying this gives us any benefit, what I'd like to explore is what we believe the right kind of tie-in of this base that's being managed elsewhere, right, might be. Because kind of as it stands, this is basically the simple pattern that we're going to start to see the nations follow, which is you've got this use case. It may actually be, for instance, you may have something upstream, like an international use case, and there's a derivation pattern that is being applied for the profiles that are most similar, right? And this is a slight shift in how we've done things in the past, but I think is more clear to our users when we say, okay, here's the actual thing my use case adds, and then adds in with impose the additional national constraints that are present within their country and their core. What I'd like us to figure out is, you know, if our CA core profiles that can be a bit stricter than, you know, just given the fact that our CA baseline is developed on a kind of minimal shared lowest common denominator, that it's more likely that the primary imposed profile relationship would happen between, you know, our use case profile and an equivalent CA core. What I'm trying to figure out is, like, are we one of the folks that like need to explore a relationship between the core and a base using impose? And what are the values of trying to kind of explore this pattern versus like having multiple imposition claims residing in the use case? Because I think what we have from Graham in Australia is this, like, yep, secondarily, this makes sense for at least one other country, but we think probably a number of them. And I think what we are maybe having to forge our own kind of findings around is, does this make sense when you have this additional layer of a base that's being managed separately, that is effectively looser than, you know, a core? What are folks' immediate reactions to this? Is there interest in exploring this type of pattern?
Honestly, so far, I cannot see any value. Sorry to see that straightforward. But actually, there might be some value, but just for my, you know, just a short, you know, understanding, and may not really, you know, may not really the right answer, but from my understanding here, this for the current phase, sorry, that blunt end, but we might think to let it grow for a while, just like obligation, and so then we can check what's the value there.
So would there be a use case like maybe patient summary where you want to have it conform to both the patient summary and the baseline? And you could use this impose profile to ensure that.
Yeah, so I think, so you're talking about if the patient summary is our use case on the left, right?
Yeah.
So impose profile would be one of the ways that you could bring in an additional set of instance requirements. So that is from this perspective, how you would combine a use case profile with a core profile. I think the secondary question is just, do you also do that like this, where you have impose like this? Right? And what are the risks of doing that? Or do you do it like this, where your imposition is on like the thing that is closest to you in its abstract nature, that you're trying to convey a relationship between? Which one were you thinking of when you were asking your question, Joni?
I think the second one, like where you basically want to make sure that a profile conforms to two different specifications.
So let me just actually play around with this. So in this case, where you typically have a base and a core, most of the things in your base are going to be subsumed and like there are already going to be rules that are in your core. And an imposeProfile extension here helps to convey that. One potential pattern where two imposeProfiles on the same target might make sense. You guys can tell I am a PowerPoint wizard. Is if, for example, I'm just actually trying to think this through. So you've got a use case, you've got your national core. Let's say other related use case profile, or like, so sometimes we have, we make different profiles for different purposes, and maybe our services would surface like a similar but slightly different API level profile for like, I think about immunizations a lot. So immunization profiles, sometimes you see ones that exist for like submission as well as for retrieval, because they convey the expectations of what the API is going to do. Now, this is kind of a fringe case, but like if you had something secondarily related, but that wasn't exactly your use case, that might be a case for trying to say, and also these things. But for the most part, like how I've heard people talk about this is like, it's a way of trying to like compartmentalize rules. And these two things tend to be like abstracted rules, increasingly abstracted rules.
You're right. Actually, you're talking about abstract. That's right. If you use abstract interface perspective, that should be okay. But if you go to class perspective, this a long time ago, it's coding perspective. I'm not a very good coder, but from class perspective, you need to have the two different class from different perspective, like a color and the shape. So as a parents, and so we can generate the children, a child, which is inherited from this shape and the color. But here in the FHIR, we pretty much it's the same, uniform, profile here, data model plus value set, some API included. So it's a very straightforward in that manner. Just make it things a little bit complicated from my perspective.
Is there any example where people can think of it? Because it's kind of like you get your requirements 1 from your parent, right? And then you get your requirements 2 in the scenario from your core. Your requirements 3, you're basically just saying that this is the summation of rec 1, 2, and 3, and probably 4, because you're introducing your own in this profile. Like, is there a scenario that's more straightforward than the one I was describing that like isn't purely an abstract profile up here where you would want to have 2 composes? I think my biggest concerns about having 2 imposes, I guess technically the extension, it goes the other way, but is that it introduces the likelihood and potential for conflicts and intersections. So if you're relying on your core to be managing all of that with anything it says it imposes or derives from, then you kind of can take that statement and have assurance that by putting an impose in this place, you're not going to introduce conflicts with your set of rules and your instance's ability to be valid to those set of rules. Whereas like you start adding more and more imposes to other things, and those other things don't have this kind of control mechanism, then like I would be concerned as an IGUID author that I would be opening myself up for more challenges with synchronization and review of requirements. There's probably a really good way of describing that. I don't know what it is, but
to me, it seems intuitive that the chained imposes would have to be used that process rather than the list of imposes, because as you say, you're going to get conflicts between them. And so what happens if you have A and B that have different definitions for some element and they're both impose profiles? So realistically, you can only do that chaining where each one is builds on the previous one.
So like if it's like because it's like the chaining almost provides like a degree of like not principledness, but like
It's
it
risk
does
management.
enact. What was that?
Let's say risk management, because realistically, you're saying that if you're doing chaining to keep that chain going, you have to be valid at all previous levels or higher levels, however you want to describe it. But
So you're distributing like that responsibility, like so that you're not carrying that responsibility in every single one of your guides, and it's the responsibility of the upstream guide that you're imposing.
expect.
Are there benefits of doing it this way? I'm sorry, of doing it, because I'm filling out this section, like, are there benefits of doing it like this instead of like this?
I'm sure there's no conflicts. It's the way to amalgamate a whole bunch of different pieces, but I can't see how you would do it and not have conflicts.
So it's more like in author's control to confirm. I'll say primary authors, post author.
Robot response.
So what about from like a social perspective? Do we think, so my concern beyond the technical of having to impose extensions on this profile is that it makes these profiles look like they're competing. It makes you have to wonder, what are the rules that are distinct in these two sets of profiles? Whereas I think this one sends a really strong message, which is the core imposes and ensures, and like really ensures, that the hard rules that are defined in the baseline are incurred. And I think that when we think about how we would talk about how impose would be used in the baseline, that this is a stronger message than asking iGuide authors to impose the baseline alongside a bunch of other things. But that's my perspective. You guys are probably thinking about it from this perspective, which is like, do I want to be managing a bunch of these extensions? Are there other benefits from this host perspective in applying multiple impose profile extensions? What about from the baseline perspective for, I'm just gonna, because this is a 2, for asking for this to be the claim that's made? Are there any benefits there?
Benefit is it's more obvious that you're claiming conformance to both of those.
And risks? Because, yeah, I think we have to think about kind of benefits and values for our sets of artifacts, but as also for our end users. So I'm trying to make that distinct where I can.
Sorry, just to roll back to the previous, try to help me to understand the purpose of this imposeProfile extension. Sorry, just roll back.
This one, right?
Is that mean this? Just sorry, go back to the you just show on the screen that a demo here. It's just
Yes,
working on a demo. Yeah, no, the demo that a building block. That's right. Yeah, the building
This
block.
one?
That's right. Is that means actually for this impose extension, would like to have one child, as what I'm understanding, just confirm two parental profile. Does it do the function for this impose profile extension solely for try to resolve or not?
Can you ask the question just a slightly different way?
Okay, so the purpose to introduce the impose profile extension just make sure that one child profile could be tested or validated to confirm with two or multiple parental profile. Is that a purpose for the impose profile extension?
It's more that the instances produced under this host profile, because it's different than just comparing, are the rules here the same as the rules here? Are the rules here breaking when they're implemented any of the rules here?
But when you mention instance, doesn't apply to the operational process, but only for testing stage. Is that right?
Well, it depends on how you're doing validation. It applies to the behavior around record validation.
Beyond or just through this exchange process?
So if, for instance, you were running a validate operation in production, well, that is very costly, or some other means that were like that, then the impose profile would be checked.
Oh, okay. Impose just like a tag. Say, okay, we have promised or tested to conform to this profile already. So instant can be treated as a conformed instance to this profile.
No, it's like these rules and also these rules.
Yes, be just like more like a statement, assertion.
Yep, an assertion that can be checked.
Yeah, just like tag. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
Well, from that perspective, it's just tag. Well,
No, hold on. It's saying that when you check conformance with this profile, you check not only what is in this profile, but also what is in this other one. Right?
Yep. And I actually think that the important piece here is that, I'll go back to the statement, can only be valid. So basically that means that if you didn't have, let's say you had rules that conflicted here with this, it would mean actually that your instance produced under these rules actually couldn't be valid because the rules that have been applied here would conflict with them. Now, this would be like a really strange case, but it is important to point it out. It's like what you're saying is this is an additional set of rules that you have to meet to be considered valid for my profile. So you have to be the rules of my profile as well as these to be considered valid for my profile. It's a little circular, but like it is actually like an intent statement.
Sorry, could you repeat again? I just wanted.
So an instance that's trying to validate against this profile can only be valid if it meets all of the rules for this profile and can meet all of these rules. That's the condition under which this profile's validity is assessed. or this, the validity against this profile is assessed. But if you broke a rule, let's say you didn't meet a rule and you're imposed, that was imposed, then you wouldn't actively be considered, your instance wouldn't be valid against your use case profile. So in patient summary, if I said, my rule is you need to give me name and given, sorry, for name, you need to give me family and given. And if in a core, I said, you need to give me name text. And my instance that I produced for the patient summary only provided name and given, it would not be considered valid against this PSCA profile because there was this additional rule around text. Now we can manage this as authors by being much more clear about where our rules live, but that is the outcome of this statement. Does that make sense, or is it still unclear?
First, I still need some time to consume, but once these slides can be shareable, that be appreciated. It's one statement. The second thing, I really strongly recommend I haven't been observer in that FMG or whatever, to think about to make two facets of this FHIR standards, because this discussion might only need to stay within the technical community. If you expose those details to the business team, I'm afraid FHIR might go through the V3's fate. Thank you.
So I think a really good next step for this is actually just to like try to throw examples against this, examples that we would expect from the baseline and examples that we would expect from other guides, and play this out, like play both the patterns out. This is a technical call. We can actually do this and build it and see what happens on the call. Would folks like that if they could see, okay, how do I map my requirements against these various things? Would you absolutely hate it and not come?
My guess is it would probably help visualize what we're talking about.
Okay. So maybe we do that on our next profiling call. We do like a little bit of a, okay, let's come up with, some examples. What are some requirements that we could imagine playing out in a scenario like this? Okay. All right. I will load these up to OwnCloud and put them in the, so like always, we'll stop the recording.